All right. Hello, hello, hello. Hey, folks. How's it going? Well, I think we're both happy to be here. Thanks for coming out. I'm going to open with just a question or two, and then Colm is going to read a little bit from the new book, House of Names. Is your mic working, sir?
Oh, yes.
All right. I'm glad to get a straight answer to that. I'm going to start by talking about the book for a second. We'll drop back into broader and wider themes. But the book came out, I think, just this month. And The Guardian, Alex Preston, a reviewer in The Guardian, said of the book that it's an ostensible retelling of the Oresteia, and he said it's ostensibly because House of Names gives us so much more that isn't in the original trilogy. This is a novel that is a celebration of what novels can do. It is a novel, it gives us interiority, specificity, the in-between stuff that is the fabric of life. We see everything that happens off stage in these plays, and this is really what interests us. Toibin is like a great actor, taking the framework provided by the events of the play and providing psychology, motivation, nuance, humanity.
Oh, God, that's good.
Yeah? Not bad. So, here's what I'm wondering. So this is a story that a lot of people know, have heard before. It's also incredibly bloody and at times sort of heartbreaking. What made you want to descend, into this and retell it and rework it?
I think there were two things. One was that I hadn't read a play by Euripides called Iphigenia in Aulis. And that's the play that Euripides wrote in old age, where he seems to have had almost thought, oh, we've given Clytemnestra such a bad deal that Electra gets all the best lines in the Oresteia, in Sophocles, and in Euripides as well, but that her mother actually, did have a motive for killing her husband Agamemnon. That Agamemnon lured her with her daughter Iphigenia, saying that I have a husband and we're going to have a wedding in the camp, and the husband is Achilles. And so if you come with all the clothes for a wedding. And so she comes with all the clothes for a wedding, and without being told that in fact Agamemnon means to actually sacrifice her. That the gods have said that the winds will not change in his favor unless he sacrifices his daughter. And he doesn't have the courage to tell her. Even when he sees her, he doesn't have the courage to tell her, actually, you're not here for a wedding. So it looks like a picture of perfect happiness. Here he is, he's reunited with his son, who's also come, with his daughter, with his wife. Everybody looking on, watched him. But a lot of people looking on would have known. And the next day, when she meets Achilles, Achilles has to say to her, do you really not know why you're here? And she doesn't. And when she finds out, she does everything to stop him. But she can't stop him, and the sacrifice takes place. And what she decides to do then, in retaliation, is wait until he returns from the wars victorious, and plan every second. And in turn, she's going to murder him. And I'm not sure that I would like to say this is what, I'm looking out at the audience, this is what we all would do or must do. But you certainly would feel that something had to be done to him on his return for what he had done. And it was when I read that play that I realized that there were aspects of this story that are not in the compact three-play Oresteia. The other thing that's not there is Orestes is the son. He's about 8 when his sister is sacrificed. And you watch him then, his sister Electra is waiting for his return. She in turn wants to get her mother. She wants to kill her mother, but she doesn't want to do it herself. She wants her brother to do it. But her brother is elsewhere. Where is he? She waits for his return. He eventually returns. But we have no evidence as to where he is or where he was. So that, for me, became extremely interesting. And from the quote you've just read, the idea then, how do you get somebody in a contemporary novel who is not a psychopath to actually murder his mother? What set of traumas, what set of weaknesses, what set of pressures are on someone to cause him to do this? And you do have to build it up very, very slowly, creating a sort of an interior for this person so that his motives are, while they remain ambiguous, they are almost clear at a certain moment. And so once I realized there were gaps in the story, the first gap being the Clytemnestra, and the second one being Orestes, I realized that I could work with this. That often, if you're a novelist looking at a press photograph, it's the blurred figure at the edge or the figure at the side that is the most interesting figure for you, rather than the central players who the journalist will write about and will be all their motives and what happened to them later will all be clear. But who's that fellow or who's that woman over there? Why is she wearing that hat? You know?
Right. Well, most of your books and stories have taken place in the, let's say, 20th century, end of the 19th or something. You're going way back to classical antiquity. So I just wonder if the Greek, Roman period, the art, theater, poetry that came out of it has had a deep meaning for you for a long time, or if you feel a strong connection to it now.
There was a very strong connection to the Greek in the late 19th century, early 20th century in Ireland, where, for example, W.B. Yeats translated the Oedipus plays,
right.
and Oscar Wilde, for example, actually went to Greece, and his father had been an amateur archaeologist and antiquarian, and Wilde studied Greek in Trinity College Dublin, and then at Oxford, and then actually he went to Greece, and of course James Joyce actually used the Odyssey as the structure for his novel Ulysses. Now, part of the reason for this is, of course, that it's not Roman. In other words, that in Ireland, circa 1900s, you would view the Roman as an empire. They had maps. They collected taxes. They advanced in a very orderly fashion. They reminded you in certain ways of the British. You know, in other words, it was an orderly empire with outposts in various places. Whereas the Greek, when you go back to it, is full of heroes, and it's not merely full of heroes, but it has this strange living literature, which can be performed on a stage now and would make people feel something very deep and very serious. But I think there's also the question that the relationship between, say, the Irish language as it was spoken in 1900 and the Irish language of the early Irish manuscripts was equal to was the equivalent of the relationship between the ancient Greek texts and modern Greek as it was spoken. Now that therefore had enormous political implications because Greece had used that sense of its ancientness, of its monuments and its literature to break away from the Ottoman Empire in the 1830s, so that it almost had dreamed itself or reimagined itself into existence in the early 19th century. And this is what Ireland was trying to do in the early 20th century, was to reimagine itself as a country. So it wasn't just that being free from England would make you richer. That wasn't the argument anyone was making, although there were some people saying it. What people were saying was, Ireland is an ancient culture, and you come from that culture. And we want to separate ourselves culturally and spiritually and emotionally from the country beside us, to which we have no cultural connection. And this, of course, required quite a lot of work, because a lot of people in Ireland were speaking English. We're making this argument in the very language of the conqueror. Mm-hmm. So it required quite a lot of, let's call it, finessing to work. but it was that idea of the sort of emotional connection to the deep, distant, and antique past. And Yeats, of course, then wrote two of his most famous poems, where he invoked Troy in a poem called the poem that he wrote about Maud Gonne, which is called No Second Troy,
Right.
where he actually thought about Ireland as it was moving towards revolution as a sort of Troy. And then when Ireland was independent, he finally wrote his poem called Leda and the Swan, where he sort of invoked where one single action, such as the rape of Leda, could lead to so many other things, such as the death of Agamemnon. So he was trying to think about the end of the First World War, the cataclysm of, say, the Russian Revolution or the beginning of Italian fascism. He was trying to work that through, again, just using a Greek metaphor or using a Greek myth as his way into that.
Right. Well, let's hear a little of the new book. I think most people here have probably just gotten the novel, so why don't you read us a few pages, starting from the beginning, if you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, this is
House of
the
Names, yeah.
this is the opening of the book, and she has just murdered her husband, and she's just murdered her husband's. He has brought a woman called Cassandra back with him, and of course she's no time for Cassandra. I mean, Cassandra begins to sort of predict the future, and Clytemnestra has no interest in that now. She just wants to get all this over. So I managed to get rid of Cassandra in a few lines. But so she has murdered her husband, and she's murdered Cassandra. I have been acquainted with the smell of death, the sickly, sugary smell that wafted in the wind towards the rooms in this palace. It is easy for me to feel peaceful and content. I spend my morning looking at the sky and the changing light. The bird song begins to rise as the world fills with its own pleasures. And then, as day wanes, the sound too wanes and fades. I watch as the shadows lengthen. So much has slipped away, but the smell of death lingers. Maybe the smell has entered my body and been welcomed there like an old friend come to visit. The smell of fear and panic. The smell is here like the very air is here. It returns in the same way as light in the morning returns. It is my constant companion. It has put life into my eyes that grew dull with waiting, but are not dull now, eyes that are alive now with brightness. I gave orders that the body should remain in the open under the sun a day or two, until the sweetness gave way to stench. And I liked the flies that came, their little bodies perplexed and brave, buzzing after their feast, upset by the continuing hunger they felt in themselves, a hunger I had come to know too and had come to appreciate. We're all hungry now. Food merely whets our appetite, it sharpens our teeth. Meat makes us ravenous for more meat, as death is ravenous for more death. Murder makes us ravenous, fills the soul with satisfaction that is fierce and then luscious enough to create a taste for further satisfaction. A knife piercing the soft flesh under the ear with intimacy and precision, and then moving across the throat as soundlessly as the sun moves across the sky, but with greater speed and zeal, and then his dark blood flowing with the same inevitable hush as dark night falls on familiar things.
It just gets nastier from there. There's a subtext that I pick up from this. I mean, it's three narrators in the book, right? So we're beginning with the woman who sets the killing in motion, in a sense, but it really all started with the gods, right? I mean, it started with the gods told Agamemnon that if they were going to prevail in battle or even get to the battle, he needed to execute, sacrifice his daughter. And even before that, the Trojan War really began. There was a quarrel between the gods, right? It was Venus and I've lost track, but there's some kind of Olympian, kind of thing where the gods provoked all of this massacre and bloodshed, right? So there's a sort of a running theme in the book about what is our relationship to the God? We as man and woman, what is our relationship to the gods? Do they notice us? Do they care about us? Do they protect us? Are they helping us? And I just want to read another passage and have you talk about it for a second. So this is Clemenstra again. She says, "It struck me then that if the gods," this is after the part he read. So she's saying, "It struck me then that if the gods really cared, if they had been watching over us as they were meant to be, they would take pity and quickly change the wind over the sea." Of course, so the reason that he's executing his daughter is to change the winds. You know, she's saying, well, wait a minute, can't the gods just handle that part themselves? You know, why does he have to kill our daughter for the sake of wind patterns? You know, and she says, "I imagine voices coming from the water, from the harbor, then cheering among the men, the flags blowing with this new wind that would align their ships to move speedily and stealthily, so that they would know victory and see that the gods had merely been testing their resolve." There's this running kind of question through the book of, do the gods care about us? Did they even notice our plight? Are the gods in decline? Are they even connected to us anymore? I wonder if that was something you were conscious of, and if it's something that you think runs through your work or through literature in general, because it feels like a very kind of primal human thing to wonder about, you know?
Yeah, I wonder if it's something that belongs to the novel itself, that the novel itself is a secular space. And all we have to do, really, when we want to think about this, is to imagine Jane Austen, whose work is filled with clergymen. But did the clergymen ever pray? And I mean, all we have to do is imagine, you know, a chapter beginning in Jane Austen. God told Mr. Darcy that he and Mr. Bingley should ride over that day and see the girls. Well, you just think, well, hold on a minute. I actually want Mr. Darcy to do the decision here, if you don't mind. And it would be true also in Henry James, if you had, for example, you know, Isabel Archer kneeling down to pray at night and saying, "God, please tell me who Osmond really is. Who's the man I married? What is he?" And God, in that second, told her, rather than the Countess Gemini, who in fact was the one who told her. You know that the novel isn't an easy space for the supernatural. Now I know that certain novelists really have, I mean, you can never say anything like this that's absolutely true. You have someone like Marilyn Robinson at the moment, who's really working in the most fascinating and subtle way in attempting to introduce a religious tone into a form that is essentially secular. My problem was that this story is so filled with the gods and different names for gods, and nobody could act without the gods, that the novel depends on human agency. It depends on choices and chances. It depends on people confronting or evading their destinies. And if you can't have them making those decisions, then the reader turns the page thinking, "Oh no, not another god. Oh, she didn't just decide one more time to ask one of the gods what to do." So very early on in the book, I had to make a decision that in those days when her daughter is sacrificed, she's dragged away, the mother, and she's buried under the ground for 3 days, just utter contempt for her. And in those days, as she's thinking under the ground, realizing, when they let me, or if they let me out of here, I will act on my own initiative. I will decide. I will appeal to no one. And that becomes an enormous shift. She thinks, I might be alone in the entire world in making this decision, which is why, of course, the killing is so unexpected. He comes back from the wars victorious. He wants to go to the bath and have a warm bath. And it's that moment when a man is at his most vulnerable, where he's got one foot in the bath and the other where he's about to put it into the bath, where she gets him and she cuts his throat. But because she's appealed to no gods, or she hasn't gone to the oracle, that her daughter, in turn, Electra, thinks, "Who told you that you could?" And it's that question, I think, that remains at the center of the book, when later on, when Orestes kills his own mother, and his friend says to him once more, "Who told you that you could?" And of course, his sister says, "Well, the gods, the gods, don't give me that. You two decided to do this." And what I'm working out of here, when I was working on this book, anything I needed, I found, a legend, I found some Irish mythology. I found some sources in Shakespeare. But I particularly found Wagner useful, where the twilight of the gods, where there's a moment in Siegfried where Wotan goes to find Erda, to whom he's been married previously, who's buried in the deep earth, and she's a mezzo or a contralto, so she's sort of the voice of deep wisdom. In one production I saw, he actually rings on an apartment building and presses a bell, and she comes sort of down in an elevator in her, in her nightdress, but normally she rises up from the earth, and she's got this beautiful, she's Patricia Barden in the current production in the Met in New York, and she's got this beautiful mezzo voice, and she tells him, I mean, it takes her 45 minutes, but she tells him that that the power of the gods is not just waning, but it will soon be over, and does he not know that? And so you're watching in those operas something that begins as being all-powerful, ending by losing its power. And I think this for me, it struck me as a very dramatic idea if one generation believes one thing and then one individual stops believing it. I mean, we're at where are we now? 500 years since Martin Luther. Right. I'm thinking about ideas where one individual decides on one given day to change the way history will move, or to just by dint of their own particular beliefs or non-beliefs.
Right, so we're kind of in a moral vacuum here, right? It's sort of a post-Nietzschean reading.
Yeah,
right?
We're in a time really when all that belief has gone and nothing has come to replace it.
Yeah.
And therefore, once Clytemnestra begins to kill, whatever happens, and what I'm thinking about here is any civil war we know begins often with one thing. And it seems that you cannot stop a spiral of killing. That one killing leads to another, leads to a third, leads to an atrocity, leads to a massive event. And to get that back into the bottle is very, very difficult. So really by the end of the novel, or by the time she's killed, Clytemnestra is ordering the most astonishing atrocities. I mean, filled with cruelty, even though she begins in the book as actually a mother leading her daughter to a wedding.
Yeah.
And you realize that trajectory is actually quite a serious one. And as you say, happening in a moral vacuum, or happening in a time when at least some of the moral air is leaving the space,
leaking
and
out,
any is coming in to replace it.
There's nothing to stop it. And we don't have, Christianity is still a few centuries out, and there's not really any boundaries here anymore, right? It's sort of. So, obviously, this book is set in. Are we talking the 5th century? Effectively, this is 5th, 6th century, something like that, right? We're in Greece and Trojan Wars. So, actually, I guess it would be even further back. You've set novels other places. I mean, you teach at Columbia University in New York. We're here in California, where you visit from time to time. To what extent are you essentially an Irish writer, and will always be, even if we ship you off to the moons of Pluto or something?
Samuel Beckett had a really good answer for that when someone asked him if he was an English writer, and he said, "Au contraire." And the island is very small, only if you measure it. And we don't feel its tiny size. In other words, there's a huge amount of topographical variation in Ireland and different accents. And one of the things you can do in Ireland, I suppose, is that I had written a novel called Nora Webster, which had come quickly after a novel called Brooklyn, which had dealt very much with the earlier generation in my family who had died. And the novels were almost efforts to reclaim them or get in touch with them again, things that were slowly going. And when the novel Nora Webster was finished, I had nowhere to go within Ireland as a novelist. That it wasn't as though I could continue and write a sequel to one of the books. I couldn't do that. And So once this occurred to me, I realized I was living, that I had lived in a country, or I'd come from a country. We had 2 civil wars in the 20th century. And civil wars were happening again, for example, in Syria. And this story seemed to me to speak to us now, as the plays still do. And therefore, I didn't think for a second, oh, I'm Irish, should I be writing this? What right do I have to take a Greek story and work with it? I didn't feel that. I believe that these stories, all the ancient stories, I'm not just talking about the Greek ones, but say the Norse ones, or even Chinese, any set of ancient stories have survived for very good reasons, in that they're any folk tales that have survived, even stories you read to children, have survived for really good reasons. And there's something in them that still has, there's a shape. There's something in them that can still matter, that can still affect us, not only emotionally, but I think also make us feel for a second that we're out of time. It doesn't really matter that these thousands of years have passed. We could still be with somebody, despite the internet, despite Hollywood, despite all the other things. We could be back there for 1 second in that time.
So let's stick with Ireland as metaphor for a minute, if you don't mind. We're at the basically 100th anniversary of all the incredible precarious stuff that led to Ireland being its own country after centuries and more of being basically under the boot of other people. I wonder if you've written a long piece, I think it was in London Review of Books, on the Easter Rising of 1916, which is one of the important early glimmers of Irish nationalism and violence. I wonder if you see any parallels between that spirit and what we've seen in 2016 with Brexit and with the election of our current president. Are there any parallels to this sort of incredible convulsions that the Anglo-American world is going through these days?
Oh, I see Brexit as being just the last gasp of that funny little empire they had on which the sun never set. And it was a terrible political mistake. It was one of those Eton boys thinking he understood his own country.
Right.
Now, we had a president for a long time. He was prime minister for a long time, and then he was president. And Eamon de Valera, and he said, he fought in the 1916 rebellion, and he said, he was asked about the Irish people. He said, oh no, he said, you see, when I want to know what the people think, I look into my own heart. And he did. And he won election after election after election. Even when he was an old, blind man, he won a further election as President of Ireland. And poor David Cameron from Eton, with all his Southern English privilege, thought that he could read the people of England. And even by the end of the Brexit campaign, there were places in the north of England said, please don't come. People don't want to see you. People will vote more to leave the more they see you. And, he misunderstood something, which is that England has no history of referenda. In Ireland, because we have a written constitution essentially based on yours, we're always having referendums on things. And the government has a particularly good way and smart way of dealing with the population over the business of a referendum, which is if we don't vote the way they want us to vote, they ask us to vote again. For example, I went to England after Brexit, and I told them, look, we voted against divorce. No, I didn't, but most people did. And the government just said, look, we do have to there's so many marriages breaking up, and we need to really put some order on this situation. So could you please vote again, and please vote the right way this time? And people said, okay, we will. And this happened again with the Lisbon Treaty, which was a housekeeping treaty for the European Union. And Irish people just said, briefly, it was a way of voting against the government, annoying the Prime Minister. And so we voted no. And the government said, this is really embarrassing for us in Brussels. Is there any way you could change? Let's have another referendum. And this time, please do it again. And this time, quite rightly, the Irish people voted yes. And there was one other one. There were 3 altogether. It was the Nice Treaty. And so it would have been quite simple for David Cameron just to say, look, this is a huge embarrassment. It's shocking. Clearly you didn't mean this. The implications of it are so enormous. Why don't we wait for a year and just think out the implications of this and have a second vote. And I think people would have seen reason in that year. But also, they would have known how to run the campaign the second time around and how to talk much more about the positive things. I mean, one of the things that has really mattered with the European Union, I have reverence for the European Union, is the idea it has maintained peace in Europe. That idea of France and Germany and England actually constantly meeting, seeing one another all the time, and
for diplomatic and economic purposes.
For
right?
economic purposes,
right.
and that people could easily move between the countries. And strangely, I mean, what is strange is how few French people and German people have seen fit to go and live in England, even though they can. They wouldn't want to. And I mean, they really wouldn't. I mean, why would you? But a lot of English people, of course, have gone to live especially in the south of Spain, for very good reasons. It's called sunshine. Now, what are we going to do with those people? And what are we going to do with those people if, up to now, they get their pensions put through banks, they can use the health service of Spain as European citizens? What's going to happen to them? What's going to happen to them now? But that all of that easy movement, which of course was exacerbated by the arrival of about 1 million Polish people in England. Now, when Polish people arrived in Ireland, we couldn't believe our luck. I mean, they were much better looking. I mean, they just looked better than we do, and they went to mass on Sunday, which we had sort of stopped doing, and they were just when the Chinese, it was like when the Chinese arrived, like they're brilliant at sport. So that if you look at the local football teams and hurling teams, there's always a great Chinese player who's utterly dedicated to the game. So that Ireland managed not to have an anti-immigration movement. No one wanted to talk about building a wall or keeping them out, or none of that rhetoric ever kept going in Ireland, even though large numbers, I mean, comparatively speaking, of Nigerians, Chinese, Polish people, Bulgarians arrived in Ireland. And I should say that no French or Germans did, and indeed no English people did either. I mean, they would all be welcome if they came, but it was the Poles who came because wages were so much higher. And it became fashionable in Ireland to say, oh, I have a wonderful Polish plumber. Listen, I'll give you his email. I'll give you his cell phone because he's the best plumber in Dublin at the moment. And that became fashionable. And then it became fashionable to have a Polish boyfriend or girlfriend. And they became all the rage in Ireland. But obviously that didn't happen in our neighbouring country, Brexit. But I'm not going to go on at the same length about the American situation, just because you know much more about it than I do. And there's no point in me telling you all about it when I should be listening to you on the subject.
Right, fair enough. Well, let's talk about something even more painful, Hollywood. So you're in Los Angeles. I think, to a lot of people, I don't know if people in this room, but I think you were probably known to a lot of Americans as the guy who wrote the novel that the movie Brooklyn was based on, which was an excellent, it helps that it was a great book and an excellent movie as well. So I'm wondering, what was the process like for you? Were you happy with the outcome? And do you have anything else cooking with one of your books possibly being rendered into a film?
I was old enough and wise enough to know that maybe someone else should write the screenplay. And I was lucky enough to get Nick Hornby to do this. And I was old enough and wise enough to leave him alone when he did it. I didn't have an email address for him or a phone number. I saw the second draft, which is very close to the final draft. I mean, he worked very well on this. And we met briefly, and I just met him to thank him, basically. And he had added a new ending, which when I saw, and I've seen the film about 7 or 8 times, it really tears me up. It really brings tears to my eyes, that ending. It isn't that I wish I'd written it. It is that I find it fully appropriate to the film. But the funniest part, really, I mean, the really funny part was that I was here for the Oscars last year, and so they told me I could go, even though I wasn't nominated for one, that I could get an invite. So I said, oh God, I'd like to go to the Oscars. I mean, they didn't tell me when I was growing up. The teachers didn't say, if you study hard, you'd go to the Oscars. Like it's slightly beyond your expectation. And my mother always told me, at important occasions, wash under your arms. They always do that when you're going anywhere. So I washed under my arms, no, sorry, I mean, I had a shower and stuff. And I put on a posh suit, and they gave me a driver. The company gave me a driver, and it was just great. I felt like $1 million. And I mean, I felt like I was out of a dream. But there's a big difference between if you're a star up for an Oscar, you go in one door, and if you're just a novelist who wrote the novel on which one of the movies is based, but not the screenplay, you go in another door. It's not just there's no red carpet, there's no carpet. But I wanted to sort of meet the others, who were up for like Nick Hornby and Saoirse Ronan, who were actually up for the Oscar. So I sort of waited around just to say hi to them. And then at one moment, I could have touched Charlotte Rampling. But I mean, when I say touched her, I could have reached over a fence, put my hand down, and really annoyed her. I think she's easy to annoy. But I didn't, because a man got onto my case and he said, "You, sir, are going inside, sir. You have no reason to be out here. You've been out here for long enough. I don't know what you're waiting for, but you're not going to get it, whatever it is. Go inside, sir." And then I went inside and I lurked around for a minute and I came back out again. He said, "You, sir, have already been told what to do, sir." And so then at the Oscar ceremony itself, I had a special wave ready for home. He said, "If you just see me waving, it's me." And but the cameras, of course, only go, to you guys at the front who are up for the awards, and the people at the back. So I didn't get to wave. I tried, but it didn't work. But there were advantages to that, which is that we were very close to the door. So every time there was an ad break, we could run out, and they had little glasses of white wine, and you could get a little glass of white wine, drink it down, and run back in, which the stars couldn't do. Charlotte Rampling couldn't do that. And so there were advantages, but I think it did let you know that the distance between writing quietly in a corner, in a room, trying to make up this story, and somebody actually getting involved in the big business of the big screen, that it is an entirely different process, and it let me know that. I mean, I have recently written a screenplay with the German director Volker Schlondorf,
Tin Drum,
who made the Tin Drum, and that was an interesting experience, and the whole idea of casting and trying to write for a particular actor, and so it is a fascinating business, but I do remember when I had my first play on, and I'm not a playwright, but I wrote a play and I had it on, and some people came to it, it was nice, and it didn't last that long or anything, it didn't, but a serious playwright who's a very nice man, is a good friend of mine, so he could afford to say this to me without losing my friendship, just whispered to me on the opening night, "Stick to the day job, you." And the day job, and we both laughed. The day job are the novels, in other words, that's my day job.
Wow.
But anything else is like moonlighting,
What you've described at the Oscars is what we have in this country instead of a class system. It's sort of a similar structure.
Yes, Americans are all equal except on the Oscar level.
Yeah, exactly. We have a hierarchy that kicks in once a year. Well, I'm wondering, you've written a novel, The Master, based on life of Henry James. You have a critical volume on the poet Elizabeth Bishop. I wonder if you could talk about a few writers, Irish and otherwise, who, called to you when you were a young man, made you want to do this, and perhaps those who along the way taught you things or sort of inspired you, even as an adult.
I think the strangest part of this story maybe is that when I was growing up, I'd say when I was about 16 or 17, when I could maybe buy books for myself or decide what I myself would read, and I'm not alone in this, that you wouldn't dream of reading an Irish book, that you just already had all that Catholicism and guilt and rain and dandruff and misery and sexual frustration. And I mean, all of that, you were living that every day and was just getting, and you saw no reason why you should read a book about it. So that, I was in a very Catholic school, and censorship had just lifted, and I won a essay competition, and I won a book token, and I came back to the school with my books, and the head priest with another priest stopped me. I thought, oh God, I'm in trouble now. Because honestly, at age 16, and I don't know how I would have known this, I had a book by Kafka, I had a book by Jean-Paul Sartre, and I had a book by Camus. I was a little nerd. And instead of taking them from me, they said, "Oh, this is great. You should, when you've read these, actually maybe we'll have a sort of seminar about them." I mean, they were sort of open about this. It was a post-Vatican II.
Right,
We have to read
right.
we have to know what's going on. And I
Right.
mean,
Opening to the
they
world,
didn't
yeah.
think much of Jean-Paul Sartre, but they thought we should all know about him. All the more to dismiss him, so we could go back
Right.
to our, our
Right.
daily communion and stuff. But the big discovery was Hemingway. And there was a
Right.
book, and again, I'm not alone in this. It was really well published. It was called The Essential Hemingway, published by Penguin, and it had a photograph of him with a beard on the front. And I read The Sun Also Rises, probably aged about 17. And I thought they were the most glamorous people. I just thought, I really want to go to Spain. I want to go drinking like they're going drinking. I want to have all the adventures of, relationship to the landscape and meeting up with different people and the sort of attitudes, even, the things they said. There was one character in the book, I remember, who went bankrupt, and I'd never known anyone who went going bankrupt.
Seemed very glamorous,
Seemed very
right?
glamorous. And they asked him, "How did you go bankrupt?" Someone asked him. He said, "Oh, two ways. First gradually, then suddenly." And I thought what a smart thing to say. I wish I could. The only time I've ever managed to say that was once I went to the dentist, and he said, "Oh my God, what happened in there?" And I said, "First gradually, then suddenly." And and after that, I read Henry James. I read The Portrait of a Lady. And it's a fascinating way that literature blows in on the wind, that it doesn't know borders, and it doesn't know class distinctions. Because here I was at the time working in a motor taxation office. It was a summer job. And every evening I was reading Portrait of a Lady about Isabel Archer, girl from Albany, left a fortune by her uncle, going off to Florence, where I'd never been, to Rome, where I'd never been. I'd never even been in England. And I found the book absolutely overwhelming. The fact that I thought it was a book about style, about stylish people trying to learn new ways of being stylish. And then halfway through the book, I realized it was a book about morality. It was a book about treachery. And I was so surprised at how I'd been misreading the book. But also, it was a book about secrecy. Because I was living in a small town when it's hard to keep a really big secret in a really small town. Somebody will always know, and they'll always tell somebody else. And so all of that idea that you could move in Europe from, in this case, they just moved simply from Naples to Florence, but it's the 19th century, with a secret that nobody else will share. And so those two books, for example, I mean, there were many other books, but those two books would have really made a difference to me. And then in my 20s, I would have discovered, W.B. Yeats was always there because the poetry was simply so beautiful. But I would have found Yeats's later poetry much more intriguing when I was in my 20s, as I would have found the entire trajectory of James Joyce and indeed Samuel Beckett. I mean, I saw a performance of Jack McGowan, which I think he performed it here. He performed it in many places, where he did a one-man show based on Beckett's prose work. And when I was 16, I saw that. And that was just, I mean, this again was in a small town in Ireland where no one had ever seen this mixture of slapstick and melancholy and deep despair. We weren't sure this was entirely serious. But yet it was. And I think anyone who saw that performance, it was a great introduction to Beckett.
Well, you've written about painters and musicians as well. I know you're interested in Francis Bacon, for instance, and other artists. And it's interesting if you look at the careers of artists in any genre. You have some who have these very brief careers or brief heydays, or they just do one thing over and over again, for their whole lives without any real development. Then you have artists who have long, rich, careers that have a lot of chapters to them. You have the Picassos, the Beethovens, the Miles Davises, and so on. What do you think's the difference between the people with the kind of short, sharp moments and those with the really robust, complex careers?
I love the idea of someone just simply doing the same thing every day. The artist Agnes Martin. just simply making those paintings more or less the same size, more or less the same lines, odd variations. And she stopped working for some years, and then when she went back, there was really no difference. She went back doing the same thing. There's an artist called Via Selmans, who used to live here on the West Coast and is now living in New York, who really has, over a period of 50 years or more, mainly done paintings and made prints and done drawings of the sea and the sky. And that's Vijacelmins. And I'm fascinated particularly by her, or by somebody like Rothko, who discovered this way of making a painting and just went in every day and made further variations on it, which is in a way what Francis Bacon did. That he found this way of placing the body at the center in an almost theatrical space, and then working his way, creating this very broadly painted or quickly painted background with this densely textured figure at the center who could be in all sorts of pain. Bacon loved all this Greek material. And he was really animated by it. And he thought the Furies were coming after him.
I'll point out, though, that Selmans did all of this with pencil. Right? She painted like Saturn and ocean waves with like little pencil strokes. So
yes, it is.
The degree of difficulty is slightly higher.
And also working with erasure, where simply it's a question of how do you erase, what marks do you make when you erase. So I'm interested in that idea of someone almost writing the same poem again and again and again. And this might seem like a different book, but it has some of the same ingredients as my very first novel, which is, the missing father, the mother, exile, and as in something like Brooklyn, where you have the second in a family, the sort of weaker one, the one who's not as decisive, and she or he then has to make their way through the world as best they can, but they have no strategy. They don't look in the mirror in the morning and say, this is what I will conquer today. So other people decide things for them. People push them around. And they can cause havoc because they're so passive up to a point, and then they're not passive. And so I'm dealing more or less with the same. I wish I wasn't. I'd love to do something new and strange. And I thought I was doing something new and strange in this. But then when I had Orestes just being this lonely, sad boy in exile, thinking about his mother, I thought, oh my God, here we go again.
So maybe for artists who have actually complex and long and multi-chaptered kind of careers, there ends up being the same structures and motifs they're coming back to and reframing them in different ways, whether it's Dylan
Picasso never got over the idea of the woman's body. And that idea of what it looked like, a woman's face, a woman's breasts, a woman's legs. He just could never, you just go through it from beginning to end, how fascinated he is by that.
Talking about Bacon.
No, I'm talking about Picasso.
Picasso, okay, right.
Picasso's...
those portraits
but also his, at the very end of his life, he did these nudes. So he still is back in the old business of being one of those boys who really loved women. And wanted to paint them and paint them and paint them, and was delighted to be back at the studio again, to have another go at the brush for another day. Doing it in a different way. Whereas the early times he had done these wonderful portraits of women in tears, or painting all the different women he had lived with or been married to.
And cubist versions of them.
With making them
four-dimensional faces.
Cubist, making them blue period. Anything was on his mind, another woman would come in. It's a sort of marvelous story. In the same way as Miro, the painter, would do, the stars, the moon, a dog, a ladder. He just had about five or six things that utterly fascinated him. And the big question then is, how many people was in Shakespeare? Because you can't say that about Shakespeare, that there was just one thing he was really interested in. It just isn't true.
Well, I want to open this up to a few questions from the audience before we close. I want to ask you about one more writer before we go. I'd be curious what this guy means to you, your life, and also your work. And if you think he speaks to our time at all, the writer who died, I think it was 40 years or 30 years ago or so, decades ago in any case, the American writer James Baldwin.
Oh, I read Go Tell It on the Mountain when I was a teenager. And that was the only book I could find that dealt with what it was like to be brought up in a religious community, in a religious world, and to belong to it and watch it, to be both watchful and involved. And I was fascinated by that book. But it was, and then of course, he wrote a gay novel called Giovanni's Room, which is set in Paris. And then he attempted in another country to bring his religious Harlem background together with his sort of gay world in another country. And I was fascinated by all those problems he faced. But there's a 1,000 volume, sorry, 1,000 volume, there's not 1,000 volumes, there's a 1,000-page volume in the Library of America. It's just his collected essays.
Yeah, it's a blast.
Look, it's 1,000 pages that really are just astonishingly prescient, astonishingly intelligent, and you just go, this was a glittering stylist, a glittering essayist. This was someone who, when he was looking, and I think it's something maybe all of us should do more, when we're trying to look at political problems that seem intractable. In other words, just say we have a particular difficulty, as I do with Brexit, or just say there's somebody here who might have a particular difficulty with Donald Trump, that you would look inwards to see, what is it that I'm feeling? How did this occur in my country or a country beside me? How did my neighbor decide this and why? And Baldwin's efforts to try and work out what was governing race relations in those very, very difficult years when the question was suddenly opened with the civil rights movement, and he went south for the first time. And he was very shocked by what he saw in the southern states of America. But he began to look inwards at his own rage, at the quality of his own rage, and say, what does my own rage mean? Instead of blaming somebody else, it wasn't that he blamed himself, but he looked inwards. And I think that film, I Am Not Your Negro, which opened this year, I think gives you a sense of his eloquence and also of his oddness. I mean, he really had a most wonderfully original mind, and I think he's a great American.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, somebody else is going to handle the questions from the audience. So,
if anyone has
Ted, you want to take that over?
Question, please raise your hand, and I'm happy to bring you the microphone as you're thinking of your question. Just a quick reminder that questions around here generally start with a W or an H and sometimes a D. They are typically short. Only Scott gets to ask follow-up questions, and we do not believe in two-part questions.
I think there was somebody just there.
Thank you, Ted, for that.
I imagine you read numerous versions of the Iliad and probably many different translations. From what you've spoken, and I haven't read your book yet, were you able to read War Music by Christopher Logue?
Yeah, I'd read War Music, but it was Anne Carson when she began to work, where I had certain problems with some of her translations, and I loved others. And they drove me back to Robert Fagles. And because I had worked in Princeton, and I had, he was dead by the time I arrived, but I knew his widow there, that I became really interested in his translations, particularly. So it was Fagles, and also his introductions to the volumes were also really good. But there were particular passages by Fagles that I thought were pure poetry. I think Christopher Logue is also marvelous. And we were just talking earlier about the Seamus Heaney translations of the. Seamus Heaney has translated Book 6 of the Aeneid.
Yeah,
which come out as a single volume.
A few months ago.
So you can see the Latin here, and you can see his English beside it, and you can look at other translations. But that whole idea of trying to translate well from the Latin or the Greek is really fascinating, because when it's bad, it's like doggerel, and when it's good, it's so muscular and really extraordinarily filled with life.
Yes, I read your book on Elizabeth Bishop, this very small book. I enjoyed it very much because you said so much about her in such a short span of time, 120 pages or something. The question is, have you always been interested in poetry and in Elizabeth Bishop?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a failed poet. When I was a teenager and at about the age of 20, it just didn't work out for me. But I read her first. I came across her name first in something with Robert Lowell. And then I found her selected poems were very well published by Chatto and Windus in the UK. And I would have certainly had that book by the time I was 18 or 19. And then when Geography 3, her last book, came out a few years later, I was absolutely fascinated by those poems. And it was the same thing as I found in Hemingway, which was that underneath the simplicity of the tone was an extraordinary texture. And it was buried there. In other words, that in order to write the simplest line, like "I caught a tremendous fish," she had to actually feel the line or work her way, or "the art of losing isn't hard to master." And you go, where is the terrible sadness in that line? "The art of losing isn't hard to master." And in some way or other, in the cadences, she managed to suggest a great deal and imply a great deal that she didn't spell out. And I was fascinated by that idea, that you could do this in prose or in poetry, and that it would somehow make the reader shiver, that you would see things more clearly for a moment by courtesy of rhythm, but not colorful rhythm that seemed in itself a form of tact. And so I started reading her very early, and what happened was that someone asked me if I wanted to write a book, and I just said there's only one person I'm really interested in, and that's Elizabeth Bishop. And they said, so I was lucky, I just got to write that book. I was so sorry when it was over. I wish it had been longer, but it was longer than they wanted. I mean, they wanted 25,000 words. I gave them 35,000 words, but I could still be doing it. I could still be writing that book because it was more. I had loads more I wanted to say.
I did finish your book recently, and it was wonderful. One of the parts that I was so moved by was, Orestes' story. And I think you were filling in things we don't know about where he disappeared to, and the beautiful story of his, adventures with the boys, and of course, I forget the name of the one he becomes intimate with. But I was wondering, how did you come up with that adventure, and, and the interior of him that was so moving in the book?
Yeah, I mean, he is away somewhere. So what I wanted first was his mother, quite reasonably, wants him out of the palace when she's going to kill his father. She just doesn't want him there. I mean, he's a young boy. And so she sends him away for, she thinks, a day or two. But actually he's kidnapped. And he's taken to this place where other boys who've been kidnapped are being held. And it's really an intolerable place. So 3 of them escape. And they move across the landscape. And what I was working with was walking across the desert in Southern California towards the hot springs in various places where you're going up and down. And I was following people who knew the trail that I didn't know. And I was just using that idea of just going for those long hikes where, if you're hiking for 2 or 3 hours, your mood can change. You can become exhilarated or mournful or melancholy, tired. And then suddenly you get energy again. So I was working with a lot of that idea, and then I wanted them to arrive somewhere that was like something from a folk tale, where 3 of them come, and there's an old woman and she's got dogs, and they kill her dogs. And this is out of Irish folklore, where when Cuchulainn kills the dog of the man says, "Well, I've no dog to guard me now." And he says, "I will be your guard." So they say to the woman, "We will be your guard." And they spend those years with her, almost in this enclosed space that's like something from another world, that's on the edge of the sea, and everything seems to be almost timeless there. Stories come in on the wind, the story of Helen of Troy, or an Irish story called The Children of Lir, and various relationships build, but different between the four of them, the old woman and the three boys, and the dog. But then, of course, the old woman dies, the boy dies, the dog dies, and the two, Orestes and his friend decide, well, what can we do now? We can't just stay here. Orestes almost wants to, but the boy, who's called Leander, who really is the leader of this group, says, we can't stay here, we have to go home. I want to see my grandfather, I want to see my father. But Orestes is not sure he wants to see anybody, but he follows. And of course, he walks back into this place filled with strategies. It's like walking into a spider's web that he walks into that he's not prepared for at all. In certain ways, he hasn't grown up. He's just been happy in this place, or almost happy, but he hasn't grown up. And so when he walks back into this world of adults, he's not ready for it. And so all of that came from imagination. I had no source for it. I just had to work out, who is this boy who does this, who murders his mother? Who is he? And that's how the imagination works. You know, if you just leave yourself alone, stay in the corner of a room, start thinking, then stop thinking, something will come to you, something more will come, something more will come. And often you're using things you know, such as I was walking in the desert some of that time. And as I was walking, I was thinking, I am Orestes. Now, where am I going? And then the picture of that scene with the old woman and those years spent came to me out of nowhere, which is the great thing about writing a novel, which is that out of nothing, all this can come.
We have time for a couple more questions. Anyone?
There's somebody down here.
Thanks. I'd like to ask you about your time in Spain and the book you wrote that came out of that. That was very early.
Your first novel, I think.
Yeah, it was the first novel, and there was also a book called Homage to Barcelona. I arrived in Spain, age 20, in September 1975, and General Franco, who'd been the dictator since the end of the Civil War, he dies in November. Now, I had nothing to do with that. I'm not responsible in any way for that event, but he dies in November. And it looks to me, and it looks to people I know, as though Spain is now ready for a second civil war. All the forces are there. The army is all ready. People don't want to give up power. And there are all these sort of communists who are second generation who are emerging. And so how is this society going to rebuild itself? And people think it's not. It's going to tear itself apart again. And what was extraordinary the following year was to watch what happened next, which was that the king, who everybody thought was not only an idiot, but a fascist, turned out to be a Democrat and a wise man. And he had the choice, under what Franco had left him with, he could choose between three prime ministers. And he asked three men, what should we do? Two of them said, go very slowly towards reform. And the third said, go very quickly towards democracy. And he went with the third. And the problem was that they had no way of communicating this to the wider population because no one believed what they saw on television. No one believed the newspapers. I mean, there was no free press. So you're living in a country with no free press where they're trying to explain to us, we're going to give you democracy, we're going to give you everything you want. So I was on the early demonstrations, and we were shouting for amnestia, libertad, amnesty and liberty. And I mean, people were just hysterical, saying we want our country back. And Catalans were Catalan nationalists, and all sorts of people were. And then, the night I realized that everything was going to change was I was in a taxi, I think it was 1976, it could have been early 77, when they legalized the Communist Party. And all the old communists were in Paris, and they flew into Madrid that night. And they could run for election. And they did, and some of them won. But suddenly that parliament, that first parliament, that idea of being able to put a bit of paper into a ballot box, and not very often, just every so often, changed the way people walked in the streets, change the streets themselves, change family life, change people's imagination, just change the world. And I saw that happen, and it could have been the worst. He could have done his worst, that king. He had all the power to tear his country asunder. And it was a miracle to see in one place at one time something emerging, which is that great imperfection we call democracy, that people in Spain might shrug about now. But I was there when I wasn't there. And I remember the first graffiti appearing on the walls, and people hate graffiti. Think it's awful, but up to then, if you were caught doing graffiti, you could be openly shot. Suddenly people realized that the army wouldn't shoot you anymore. So they could scroll anything they wanted on a wall, and kids could do this. And it was a very exciting time, and I probably should go back and write something else about it at some time, because it was really a remarkable, it was a remarkable period. And it just made me believe absolutely fundamentally in that strange business of the bit of paper and the ballot box. Is there somebody there?
And our final question for the evening.
Yes, do you have any thought of gathering your various portraits of artists like those in Esquire and reviews in a book?
I've written a lot about visual art. I was art critic for Esquire in England for a good while. I put them all on my website, or the ones I could find. So they're free and they're there to read. And then I thought, if some publisher asked me, but then no publisher did. So I think there are a lot of art books, and but I just thought if I just put those online, that they would be there. I mean, they're under my own name, and I love doing it, and I educated myself, and I think that it just was being able to write about people like Francis Bacon and V.S. Selmans and Rauschenberg, and all of that was tremendous. But no one has asked me, I suppose because I don't think of enough books, and maybe there are enough books coming out about art without me adding to them. But thank you very much for mentioning it. I'm a failed poet and a failed art critic, so
Well, and that wraps up a wonderful evening. Thanks, Scott, for
thank you very much,
interviewing
Scott.
Colm.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colm.